I've just been lucky. I think the greatest attribute is I don't smoke.
When you've spent 5 decades in the spotlight, surrounded by some of the most beautiful women in the world, it's easy to assume you've experienced every kind of romance possible. Rod Stewart lived that life. He had the supermodels, the Hollywood actresses, and the passionate affairs that made tabloid headlines. He had the money, the fame, and the swagger that came with being one of rock's greatest icons. But recently, during a candid interview looking back on his life, Rod Stewart made a confession that surprised even his closest friends. Among all the women he'd known, all the relationships he'd had, there was one he genuinely believed he'd let slip away too easily. And the painful irony is that she was also the woman he treated the worst. Her name was Rachel Hunter. Now, you might think Rod Stewart's greatest regret would involve some legendary Hollywood romance or a passionate affair from his golden years. But Rachel Hunter wasn't just another conquest in his endless string of relationships. She was different. She was the woman he married, had children with, and then watched walk away because of the very lifestyle that made him famous in the first place. The story of how they met is almost too perfect to be real. It happened in a Los Angeles nightclub in 1989, just a few months after his marriage to his second wife had crumbled. Rod was at a vulnerable moment, freshly separated and trying to avoid spiraling into the chaos that had destroyed his previous marriage. Then Rachel walked in. She was 21 years old, a striking New Zealand model with blonde hair, piercing eyes, and a presence that stopped conversations mid-sentence. What made that moment even more remarkable was that Rachel had no idea who Rod Stewart was. She struggled with facial recognition, she later explained, and when she approached him that night asking for an autograph, she genuinely didn't recognize him as one of the world's biggest rock stars. For Rod, this was intoxicating. Here was a beautiful woman interested in him not because of his fame, his wealth, or his status but because something about him caught her attention. He was captivated immediately. Their connection moved with remarkable speed. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Within months, Rod was convinced he'd found something rare. Unlike the parade of brief affairs and casual encounters that had defined his romantic life, Rachel felt different. She felt like the one. Rod's family had serious doubts from the beginning. The age gap alone was staggering. A 21-year-old woman with a 45-year-old man? The mathematics of that relationship concerned everyone around him. His own sister pulled him aside and warned him that marrying someone so young, someone still figuring out who she was as a person, was a recipe for disaster. But Rod ignored the warnings. He was in love, or at least convinced himself he was. In 1990, just 3 months after they met, they got married. The wedding was a whirlwind event that captured headlines and seemed to confirm what Rod had been telling himself all along. He'd found his soulmate. He'd finally discovered the woman who would ground him, who would make him want to abandon the wild lifestyle he'd maintained for decades. For the first time in his adult life, Rod Stewart seemed genuinely ready to build something stable and lasting. The couple quickly started a family. Their daughter Renee was born in 1992, and their son Liam arrived 2 years later in 1994. To the outside world, Rod Stewart appeared to have finally achieved what had eluded him his entire life: genuine domestic happiness. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. The same man who'd promised to change, who'd told Rachel that he was ready to leave his wild days behind, was gradually reverting to old patterns. The temptations of fame and celebrity never really went away. They just waited patiently in the background, knowing that eventually, the addiction would pull him back in. What Rachel discovered, slowly and painfully, was that you cannot simply erase decades of a lifestyle by falling in love. The parties, the attention from other women, and the constant chaos that surrounded Rod's world, these weren't things he could just turn off because he'd made a commitment. They were woven into the fabric of who he'd become. Rod would later admit, with a kind of embarrassed honesty, that he'd never been particularly good at breaking up with women. He was a coward about it, he said. That same cowardice applied to being faithful as well. While Rachel was at home raising their 2 children, navigating the strange isolation of being married to one of the world's most famous rock stars, Rod was gradually sliding back into the behavior that had defined him before they met. The betrayals, when they came, hit Rachel with devastating force. It wasn't just that Rod was unfaithful. It was that he was unfaithful in ways that felt deliberately cruel. He didn't hide it particularly well. Sometimes it seemed like he almost wanted her to know, as if some part of him was still that reckless young rocker who didn't believe normal rules applied to him. Rachel tried to make it work. She really did. She adjusted, adapted, and attempted to accept the reality of being married to a rock legend. But there's a limit to how much any person can endure, and Rachel Hunter eventually reached hers. By 1999, just 9 years after that magical night in the Los Angeles nightclub, Rachel made the decision that devastated Rod more than any other breakup in his life. She walked away. Unlike the other women Rod had carelessly discarded over the years, Rachel's departure left a wound that never quite healed. And Rod knew exactly why. Deep down, he understood that Rachel had given him something genuine, something precious. She'd offered him a real chance at stability, at family, at a different kind of life. And he'd responded by taking her for granted and betraying her repeatedly. What made it worse was that Rachel left not out of anger or drama, but out of something far more painful: resignation. She'd simply come to accept that she couldn't change him, couldn't save him, couldn't be enough to make him want to be a better version of himself. She was tired of the celebrity lifestyle. She was exhausted by the lies and the infidelities. She wanted a normal life, a quiet life, a life where she could raise her children without constantly wondering what her husband was doing or who he was with. When Rod reflected on this years later, he realized something crucial. Rachel hadn't left him because she stopped loving him. She left him because she finally loved herself enough to demand better. And that realization haunted him. In the years that followed Rachel's departure, Rod threw himself back into the very lifestyle that had destroyed his marriage. There was a 6-month period, right after the breakup, where he was completely alone. His bass player, concerned that Rod was rebounding too quickly, had withheld the phone number of another woman who'd caught his attention. The bass player thought Rod needed time to process the loss, to understand what he'd done wrong. But Rod later admitted that even he knew his friend was right. He didn't deserve another chance at love so quickly. He hadn't learned anything yet. He hadn't done the work necessary to become someone capable of real commitment. Yet when Rod finally did connect with Penny Lancaster, his current wife, something shifted. He was older now, worn down by years of excess and self-sabotage. He'd lost the energy that once drove him to chase every beautiful woman who caught his eye. He'd finally begun to understand, in a way that youth had prevented him from grasping, what he'd thrown away with Rachel. By the time he married Penny Lancaster in 2007, Rod Stewart had become a different man. Not entirely different, he was still Rod Stewart, still capable of excess and irresponsibility. But he'd been humbled by loss. He'd been taught by Rachel's departure that some things, once lost, cannot be recovered. When Rod Stewart looks back on his life now, he sees it clearly divided into chapters. There's the chapter where he was young and hungry, desperate to escape his working-class roots. There's the chapter where he achieved everything he'd dreamed of and then spent years destroying it through carelessness. And there's the chapter where he finally began to understand what actually mattered. Rachel Hunter belongs to that middle chapter, the one where Rod had the world at his fingertips but was too blind and too arrogant to recognize what he was holding. In interviews over the past few years, Rod has become increasingly reflective about Rachel. He doesn't blame her for leaving. He doesn't make excuses about the era or the culture of rock and roll. Instead, he simply acknowledges the truth: Rachel deserved better. She deserved a man who would choose her every single day. She deserved a partner who would protect their family instead of taking them for granted. She deserved someone who understood that real strength comes from commitment and fidelity, not from conquest and excess. What Rod failed to understand at the time was that Rachel's youth wasn't a weakness to exploit, it was a vulnerability he had a responsibility to protect. She'd married a man 37 years her senior. She'd entered a world of unimaginable fame and privilege. She tried, with everything she had, to build a stable family life in the midst of absolute chaos. And Rod had responded by treating her like just another woman in a long line of women. The painful irony is that Rod claims he was faithful to Rachel Hunter in a way he'd never been faithful to anyone else. He insists that he never cheated on her with another woman. But he did cheat on her in a more fundamental way. He cheated on their marriage by refusing to fully commit to it. He cheated by keeping one foot in the celebrity lifestyle, by maintaining the option to disappear into the chaos whenever he felt like it. He cheated by failing to show up emotionally in the ways that truly mattered. Years after their divorce, Rod would bump into Rachel occasionally at events or through mutual friends. Those encounters were always awkward and tinged with regret. Rachel had moved on. She'd built a quieter life, away from the spotlight. She'd found peace in normalcy. And Rod, watching from the outside, finally understood what he'd lost. Rachel Hunter represented something Rod had spent his entire life running from: the possibility of genuine, ordinary happiness. She'd been willing to give it to him. She'd been willing to be the anchor that kept him grounded. But Rod wasn't ready. He wasn't mature enough. He wasn't evolved enough to recognize that what she was offering was infinitely more valuable than any of the fame or attention or physical pleasure he'd chased in the years before and after. The woman Rod Stewart shouldn't have let go wasn't some mythical figure from his past. She was Rachel Hunter, a real woman who loved him, who tried to save him, and who ultimately had to save herself by walking away. And the tragic beauty of Rod's late life reflection is that he now understands this completely. He gets it in a way that only comes with decades of hindsight and regret. If he could go back to that nightclub in 1989, knowing what he knows now, Rod Stewart says he would do everything differently. He would cherish every moment with Rachel. He would choose her, consistently and faithfully, over every temptation that came his way. He would build the life she wanted to build with him. He would prove to her, day after day, that she mattered more than his reputation, more than his ego, more than his addiction to the lifestyle that had consumed him for so long. But we don't get to go back. We only get to move forward, carrying the weight of our choices and the lessons learned too late. For Rod Stewart, Rachel Hunter will always be the woman he shouldn't have let go. She'll always represent the road not taken, the life he could have had, the man he could have become. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy of their time together, not the bitter ending, but the permanent reminder of what's possible when you have the chance to choose love, really choose it, fully and completely. Rod Stewart had that chance. And he let it slip through his fingers. The aftermath of Rod's separation from Rachel Hunter was where the real transformation began, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Rather than learning from his mistakes immediately, Rod initially continued the patterns that had driven Rachel away. He returned to the lifestyle, the parties, the attention from other women. It was a regression, a temporary escape into the familiar comfort of behavior that required no emotional growth or vulnerability. But something was different this time. The thrill was gone. What had once felt liberating now felt hollow. The conquests that had once defined his identity now felt meaningless. Rod was getting older, and more importantly, he was finally becoming self-aware enough to recognize the cost of his choices. In 1999, while preparing for a tour, Rod's team hired a photographer named Penny Lancaster. She was a striking woman, tall, blonde, successful in her own right as a model. On the surface, she fit perfectly into Rod's established pattern. She had the physical attributes that had always attracted him. She represented the kind of conquest that had occupied his thoughts for decades. But Rod's bandmates, recognizing the danger, tried to intervene. His bass player understood that Rod was still raw from the breakup with Rachel. The musician was concerned that Rod would simply repeat the same destructive cycle that had ruined his marriage. So the bass player took Penny's phone number and, deliberately, didn't give it to Rod for 6 months. It was an intervention born from genuine care, a friend trying to protect Rod from himself. Looking back on this moment, Rod admits that his bandmate was absolutely right. He wasn't ready for another relationship. He needed time to grieve, to reflect, to understand what had happened and why. But eventually, when Rod finally connected with Penny, something unexpected occurred. Rather than approaching the relationship with his characteristic recklessness, Rod found himself behaving differently. He was more intentional, more present, more committed to building something real. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the haunting memory of how badly he'd hurt Rachel. Perhaps it was finally, after decades of searching, understanding what actually mattered.
Whatever the reason, Rod's relationship with Penny evolved into something more stable and genuine than anything he'd experienced before.
He still had his moments of excess. He once spent $12,000 on a shopping trip to Dolce & Gabbana, with the strange condition that Penny could only wear the clothes when they were together. He still carried the possessiveness and control issues that had always lurked beneath his charismatic exterior. But for the first time, he seemed genuinely invested in making a relationship work. They married in 2007. They had children together.
And most importantly, Rod stayed. He didn't run away. He didn't disappear into the chaos.
He showed up, day after day, making the choice to be present and committed. Whether this redemption came too late for Rachel Hunter is a question Rod has had to sit with. The answer is painful and clear: yes, it came too late.
Rachel had already moved on.
She'd already built a life without him. She'd already done the emotional work necessary to move past the hurt and betrayal. When they occasionally crossed paths after their divorce, there was kindness between them, but also a kind of irreversible distance.
Rachel had become someone who didn't need Rod Stewart anymore.
And Rod, finally understanding her value, could only watch from the outside as the woman who should have been his partner lived a life that no longer included him.
This is the real tragedy of Rod's story.
Not that he eventually learned to be a better man, he did, and that's admirable. But that he learned this lesson at Rachel's expense. He learned it by losing her. He learned it by watching someone he truly cared about walk away because he'd failed to appreciate her while he had the chance. In his late 70s now, Rod Stewart has become remarkably open about this regret. He's spoken about Rachel in interviews with a kind of tenderness and respect that he rarely extended to her while they were married. He's acknowledged, publicly and repeatedly, that she deserved better. He's admitted that she was the one woman he shouldn't have let go. And in doing so, he's offered something that's actually quite rare in celebrity culture: a man taking full responsibility for his failures, without excuses or justifications. This doesn't erase the pain he caused Rachel. It doesn't undo the years she spent trying to make a broken marriage work. It doesn't restore what was lost. But it does suggest that Rod Stewart, somewhere along the way, finally became the man that Rachel had hoped he could be. He just became that man about 30 years. The most poignant aspect of Rod Stewart's reflection on Rachel Hunter is that it reveals something profound about human nature and relationships.
We often don't understand what we have until it's gone.
We take for granted the people who love us most. We assume there will always be time to change, to appreciate, to make things right.
And then one day, we realize that assumption was wrong.
Rachel Hunter gave Rod Stewart something that no other woman in his life had offered: unconditional support combined with clear boundaries. She loved him, genuinely, but she also respected herself enough to walk away when that love was being systematically destroyed.
That combination is rare.
In the years before Rachel, Rod had women who enabled his worst behavior, who accepted his infidelities and excuses, who sacrificed their own dignity for the chance to be near him. In the years after Rachel, Rod finally found a partner in Penny who had her own strength and independence. But Rachel represented something in between: a woman who was young enough to be shaped by the relationship, old enough to have standards about how she should be treated, and strong enough to enforce those standards by leaving.
Rod's failure with Rachel wasn't about loving her insufficiently.
It was about failing to respect her enough. It was about taking her for granted. It was about assuming that her love would be unconditional, that she would accept whatever treatment he felt like giving her, that his fame and wealth and charm were sufficient compensation for emotional betrayal.
He was wrong about all of it. Rachel needed more than charm. She needed consistency. She needed faithfulness.
She needed to be chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, over the endless stream of temptations that surrounded Rod's life. And when he failed to provide those things, she left. Looking at Rod Stewart's life from this perspective, you can see a man who spent decades getting exactly what he appeared to want: freedom, variety, the ability to do whatever he pleased without consequences.
But freedom without love is just isolation. Variety without commitment is just emptiness.
And the ability to do whatever you please eventually leaves you doing nothing but running from your own regrets. Rachel Hunter forced Rod to confront the reality of these truths. By leaving him, she gave him the greatest gift a person can receive, the opportunity to change, to grow, to become someone better. Rod eventually took that gift, though it came far too late for their relationship. He changed, but he changed for Penny Lancaster, not for Rachel Hunter. He learned his lessons, but he learned them at Rachel's expense. This is the real message of Rod's story, and it's one that extends far beyond his particular circumstances. We all have the opportunity, right now, to be better partners, better friends, better versions of ourselves. We all have people in our lives who deserve more appreciation, more effort, more genuine commitment. And we all tend to assume there's time to change later, to appreciate later, to get it right later. But the truth that Rod Stewart has finally learned, after a lifetime of mistakes and regrets, is that later often never comes. Rachel Hunter was the woman Rod shouldn't have let go. But more importantly, she was the woman who showed him what actually mattered. And if his public reflection on this loss helps even one person appreciate the people in their life before it's too late, then perhaps there's some redemptive value in that regret. Perhaps Rod's pain can become a lesson for someone else. Perhaps his failure can become a warning. Perhaps the life he lost can help others avoid losing the lives they have.